Hello Zero Books readers. In this video we'll take a look at capitalist realism as understood by the late Mark Fisher and as espoused by the Union professor and anti-social justice warrior YouTube star Jordan Peterson.
And then when the Marxists say, well, that wasn't real Marxism, what it really means, and I've thought about this for a long time, it's the most arrogant possible statement anyone could ever make. It means, if I would have been in Stalin's position, I would have ushered in the damn utopia instead of the genocidal massacres, because I understand the doctrine of Marxism and everything about me is good. It's like, well, think again, sunshine.
It's important to start with an admission. Zero Books is a critical theory imprint, which means that we publish the most degenerate, homo, non-binary Marxist dreck imaginable. If Richard Spencer died and went to hell, the reading list the devil would give Spencer before kicking him into the fire pit would probably consist of our back catalog. And the most cuckish, most homo, most degenerate book in the Zero Books back catalog has got to be Mark Fisher's 2009 classic, Capitalist Realism. In it, Fisher whines and whines. He pisses and moans about how pop music, Hollywood films, and the ghost of Margaret Thatcher are imposing an ideology on the world, an ideology called Capitalist Realism. But the first line of the book might surprise you. The first line is this: it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. Fisher's thesis is that we live in a time of reflexive impotence. To put it another way, Fisher is saying that we've all become cucks. And he specifically points to university life as a symptom. According to Fisher, the students he taught represented the forefront of our cultural impotence. While previous generations had utopian visions, well, yesterday's young people took to the streets in a manly effort to change the world. British students, in 2009 anyway, appeared to be totally disengaged. He wrote, "Many of the teenage students I encountered seemed to be in a state of what I would call depressive hedonia. Depression is usually characterized as a state of anhedonia, but the condition I'm referring to is constituted not by an inability to get pleasure, so much as it is by an inability to do anything else except pursue pleasure. There's a sense that something is missing." The capitalist realism that Fisher talks about is a lived experience with many different pieces. Another kind of capitalist realism isn't experienced indirectly as a psychological or sociological condition, but argued for. And this brings us back to Jordan Peterson. For the remainder of this video, we'll take a close look at Peterson's capitalist realism in an effort not just to prove him wrong, but also to discover what he gets right.
Back to the postmodern type. So, it got to the point where there's just no way you could be a Marxist, especially after Solzhenitsyn, because Solzhenitsyn wrote this great book, which is actually out of print, for crying out loud, which I've actually been able to popularize like mad over the last 3 months, which is, really mind-boggling. And what Solzhenitsyn did in his genius manner, because he's up there with Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, like, man, that guy, he's a towering intellect and a person of spectacular moral force, like he put himself on the line for that book. He memorized it when he was in the prison camps. It's 3 volumes that thick, It's like 2,000 pages of someone screaming, the smartest person you've ever met, the wisest person you've ever met, screaming in outrage for 2,000 pages. It's no bloody wonder it's out of print. Anyways, what Solzhenitsyn did was take on this claim you often hear the radical leftists make about communism, about Marxism. They say, Well, that wasn't real Marxism. It's like, okay, well, how many countries do you need to disprove your thesis? How many millions of people have to die before you might admit that you're wrong? Well, obviously more than 100 million, because that's the approximate total. That's probably an underestimate, but we'll be conservative, because adding another 10 million doesn't really make that much difference. So Solzhenitsyn took that argument apart, partly in his book Lenin in Zurich.
To start with, Peterson is right that Alexander Solzhenitsyn's book is a compelling indictment of the Soviet Union. He's right to point out what a shit show the Soviet Union turned out to be, and he's right to suggest that today's self-identified Marxists would do well to read Alexander Solzhenitsyn's book, The Gulag Archipelago. He's wrong when he says the book is out of print. But then Jordan Peterson blames Marxism for the atrocities committed by every nation-state that has ever called itself socialist or communist. And he says that the 100 million deaths caused by these countries are enough to discredit Marx and his ideas. Is that a reasonable assertion? It seems so at first blush, possibly, but let's try applying that logic in a different direction. How many millions of deaths have been caused by those countries influenced by the ideas of John Locke? After all, John Locke is the father of liberalism. Well, let's start with the French Revolution. 40,000 were killed during the Reign of Terror. Now that's hardly a drop in the bucket, right? But it's worth noting because this Reign of Terror was arguably the founding act of what I'll call liberal bourgeois democracy. And if you calculate all the deaths from famine and war and purposeful bombings of civilians, and you throw in the purposeful acts of genocide, what you'll find is that Locke, like Marx, is responsible for over 100 million deaths. The skeletons in Locke's closet pile up to the sky. Should we abandon liberal principles? Should we abandon democracy? The answer to that is supposed to be a self-evident no. If we're willing to let Locke off the hook here, though, we should also let Marx out of jail, too. Let's grant ourselves the right to continue to read and think about ideas that have proven to be dangerous in the past, and let's not blame these thinkers for the atrocities acted out by various states. Okay, so let's skip to the bit about postmodernism.
The sleight of hand was, oh, well, fine, we'll just play a different oppressor versus oppressed game, and we'll introduce identity politics. It's like, okay, you're not being oppressed because you're a member of the working class, you're being oppressed because you're a woman. Or you're being oppressed because you have an ethnicity that's outside the main paradigm, whatever that might be, or it's because of your sexual preference or your sexual identity, whatever places you in some manner outside the normative culture. And the thing is, the postmodernists, you might think, well, your culture is good for something. It gives you a hierarchy of value. It rewards competent people. It gives you a direction so you can climb up, because otherwise everything's leveled to nothing, and then why do anything? Well, they don't care about any of that. They don't believe that there's any such thing as competence. They don't believe that there's any such thing as up. This is all, postmodernism wipes all of that out.
To start with, Marx's critique of capitalism is not merely the observation that some people have nothing to lose but their chains, while others, the capitalists, are parasites upon the working man's back. While it's true that Marx did spend a lot of time outlining the terrible conditions that workers suffered under and suffer under, while he was moved by the plight of women and children in factories, while he did object to the wretched conditions imposed on working people in general, he did not ultimately blame a simple oppressor dynamic for these problems. Nor did he want to abandon and destroy all culture and all cultural impositions. As I pointed out in a previous video, if there was a thinker who thought of society as a struggle between oppressor and oppressed. It wasn't Marx, but Peterson's favorite philosopher, Friedrich Nietzsche. Peterson isn't describing Marx's ideas, but rather he's giving us a Nietzschean description of Christianity. And we can see this by quoting from The Genealogy of Morals, where Nietzsche gives a description of the consciousness of the Christian. And it sounds quite a bit like the consciousness that Peterson attributes to Marxists. Quote, "When the oppressed, downtrodden, and outraged exhort one another with the vengeful cunning of impotence, they say, 'Let us be different from the evil, namely good.' And he is good who does not outrage, who harms no one, who does not attack, who leaves revenge to God, who keeps himself hidden as we do, who avoids evil and desires little from life, like us, the patient, humble, and the just." What Peterson calls postmodernity would more rightly be called Christian morality. And the way he attaches postmodernism to Marx's ideas makes no sense, given that Marx believed in universalism, human reason, and human power. It's Nietzsche, and not Marx, who assumes that the ruling cultural ideas of any society can best be understood as imposed by sheer force of will. But here's the best bit from Jordan Peterson. Here's the real challenge.
They don't believe that value structures exist, or if they are, they're irreplaceable with some other value structure. They certainly don't believe that they have any biological grounding, that there's any such thing as a human being. It's all socially constructed, which is really convenient if what you want to do is be the author of an entirely social constructed utopia that you can run. And then when the Marxists say, well, that wasn't real Marxism, what it really means, and I've thought about this for a long time, it's the most arrogant possible statement anyone could ever make. It means, if I would have been in Stalin's position, I would have ushered in the damn utopia instead of the genocidal massacres, because I understand the doctrine of Marxism and everything about me is good. It's like, well, think again, sunshine. You don't understand it. You don't understand it. And you're not that good. And if the power was in your hands, assuming you had the competence, which you don't, you wouldn't have done any better. And even if you had, there would have been someone else waiting right behind you to shoot you the first time you actually tried to do anything good. And that's what happened to all the old guard who ran the damn revolution. Stalin rounded them all up and shot them, along with their families and millions of other people. So even if you do happen to be that avatar of moral purity that you claim implicitly, the probability that you'd get to act out your goodness in relationship to those possessed by your ideology is zero.
So here it is. We who want to hold on to Marx and his writings are condemned. Let's work backwards through what Peterson said here. He stands again on the massacres attributed to Marx. And again, it's easy to see that the same number of bodies can be stacked up at the feet of the father of liberalism. But more importantly, what Peterson does here is push forward with passion his idea that Marx wanted to create a new culture or a new ideology. But he didn't. Marx was a materialist. That is, he did believe in biology and in material reality. Marx did think there was such a thing as bedrock humanity, and he called it species being. And his aim wasn't to create a new state or a new type of ruling class, but to take advantage of the way liberal bourgeois capitalism was transforming the material basis of society, to take advantage of this transformation in order to create a better, more stable, more humane, and freer society than the one Locke and his friends presaged in their writings. Peterson would be 100% right here if understanding Marx was supposed to give you a recipe or a set of instructions on how to rule. If Marx was Machiavelli, then this impassioned denunciation of him would be justified. And let's go further. In Mao's China and the former Soviet Union, there really was an attempt to construct a socialist society on the foundation of a new political authority, rather than on a new way of working and relating to what's called the means of production. Historically, Marxists did fail to change the foundation of society. They did become authoritarian, and they did shoot each other in the back. In this way, the Russian Revolution wasn't ultimately different than the French Revolution. However, Peterson goes wrong when he shuts down inquiry and throws Marx into the dustbin of history. We're no more justified abandoning Marx's critique of capitalism than we are in abandoning the principles of liberalism. So, is it supremely arrogant to believe that we might be able to take up Marx's critique of capitalism and understand it better? The only way to answer yes to that question is to say that we're at the end point in our understanding. It's to argue, along with Francis Fukuyama, that the world as it is the best of all possible worlds. But if we do think that, aren't we simply accepting the carnage, the bodies, and even more, the senseless and aimless culture of distraction? This world that can't, as Fisher puts it, get beyond the pleasure principle is not only permanent, but everlasting?
And if I return to that problem of who will voice the discontent at liberalism, again, the problem is that only the right-wing nationalist populists are effectively doing it. And so I'm not so much against liberalism. My message to liberals is, are you aware that you, in the sense not they personally, but your own dynamic of your own system is generating this nationalist, populist, potentially racist reaction, and that the only way to save what is worth saving in liberalism, sense of freedom, solidarity, and so on, all that, liberalism, what is worth saving in it, will be saved only through a revitalized, more radical left. I think the future will be to simplify it to the utmost, Berlusconi or new communism.
Thank you very much, Slavoj Žižek.
Thank you for offering me a mouthpiece for my propaganda.